Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back to it. Let's get right back into where we left off in class. We were talking about New Kingdom Egyptians, right? We're talking about the New Kingdom Egyptians. We're getting into what imperialism means, right? We got busy taking over several different areas, creating our empire and stuff like that, just like the Egyptians did during their New Kingdom period, right? We talked about how there's a good chance that the early Hebrews might have been related to like the Hyksos, or maybe when the Egyptians went up and took over what is modern-day Israel and things like that. So we do know also that there is going to be widespread slavery that actually goes down in ancient Egypt during these times of conquering and stuff, and this relates to, of course, the Old Testament of the Bible, because historians believe that the story of the Exodus, which was the Jewish people leaving Egypt with Moses, happened during this time period, right? So we are going to be wrapping up the Egyptians in this flip, right? We're going to be like wrapping them up. We're going to be moving on to some of our other like civilizations and stuff like that, and getting more in depth when we talk about these other little smaller kingdoms, right? We're going to talk about the Phoenicians in this like flip. We're going to also briefly talk about the Israelites as well, right? Now, getting into it though, you are going to see also a huge, massive growth in gold and wealth and all these other different items coming into Egypt during this New Kingdom period, right? The New Kingdom period could probably be considered the most successful period for the entirety of the ancient Egyptian culture, right? The 18th dynasty, the 23rd dynasty, all these other multiple different little dynasties during the New Kingdom period are going to bring a massive amount of wealth and also leave behind a huge amount of artifacts as well for us to actually find and see. Now, ironically enough, though, jumping back to the 18th dynasty, right? I know that somebody in class today, and I cannot remember who it was, did ask about King Tut at one point. He is from the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom period, right? He was around when architecture was blowing up and the riches of the entirety of like Egypt were blowing up. This, for example, right here is one of the temples of Ramses II right here with the giant figures on the side. We've also got huge freeform sculptures that are coming around. We also have massive temples being built to the kings and the pharaohs and things like that in ancient Egypt during this time period. And we're seeing a massive growth in architecture. And all this was happening during the 18th dynasty and going forward into several other ones in the New Kingdom period. But ironically enough, two people that are pretty famous but deserve a heck of a lot more fame and credit are not Tut, but his parents, right? So the thing about it in general is that the parents of King Tut were Akhenaten and Nefertiti, right? Akhenaten and Nefertiti were two co-monarchs that led Egypt during the 18th dynasty, right? Which is also very interesting due to the fact that Akhenaten and Nefertiti did one thing that they were very well known for during this time period. And they tried to push ancient Egypt to a monotheistic religion. What? All right, so I know it's absolutely crazy, right? A monotheistic religion in a very polytheistic environment where they've got Amun and Ra, and I talked to Olivia Meyer about that for like a day and a half because it's like we got to make sure that we understand that early Egyptians were polytheistic. Now you see why I talked about that, right? Because I needed to be able to set up the differences when Akhenaten and Nefertiti come in. So Akhenaten actually like started this entire concept, right, of being ruled over or having a religion that is focused completely around one chief sun god, right? Like basically an Amun-Ra type, but that is only an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, monotheistic god, right? And you can even see it in his name. When he took rulership in the 18th dynasty, he calls himself Akhenaten, right? An allusion to Aton, the god that he is bringing in and trying to push like Egypt towards this religion, right? Now Nefertiti, his wife, also it's very important that we know, was a co-monarch along with her husband, right? She had just as much power as she did. She actually moved a lot of things as well as he did. And then also when he died, she effectively ruled as the queen pharaoh of Egypt, right? Completely on her own for a time period and stuff like that while King Tut was coming of age, right? Now, the thing that ends up happening, though, is Akhenaten and when Nefertiti end up dying, and also really, really fun fact as well, technically, Nefertiti is actually Tut's, like, aunt/stepmom, because ironically enough, Akhenaten had to have kids with his sister. All right, so, like, the big thing about it is, like...
Ew. Ew, ew, I hate... Ew, 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 ew. Ew. Ew, David. Ew. Ew, ew. Oh, ew. Ew.
Yeah, exactly, right? Ew, gross. All right, so, like, yeah, the big thing about it in general is Akhenaten actually had King Tut with this other woman named, like, the younger lady or something like that. Let's look it up together real quick. Tut mom. All right, like, who is King Tut's mom? All right, yeah, oh my God. Yeah, like, so the younger lady, right? Literally, she was a woman named the younger lady who was actually brother and sister with Akhenaten, and then they had to have a child together, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that actually this is an Egyptian cultural thing, especially in their ruling bodies and ruling houses. Incest was actually promoted to try and keep power within the dynasty. So yeah, exactly. Like the dynasty only had children with other members of the dynasty. It's really gross. And so like the big thing about it though as well is that you're going to see also King Tut had like some different defects and stuff like that when he was born. He was a little crusty looking. Like old bull could have had a better haircut and stuff like that. King Tut reconstruction. All right, so like yeah, literally this is what we believe King Tut actually like looked like. Like this is what he like looked like whenever he was actually like really alive and stuff. Man, old bull got a long neck. Like look at that thing right there. Like, yeah, so we actually believe that King Tut might have had some birth defects. He probably walked with a cane also for most of his existence, either due to an injury or a broken appendage or something like that. And we also do believe as well, when we're talking about him, that he also denounced his parents after they died, right? Like, after they died, he actually we believe, took Egypt back to the polytheistic religion, the one with Amun and Ra and stuff like that. And we can actually see that in his name, because if you go look this up, Tutankhamun is his real full name. King Tut's real name, Tutankhamun, right, was actually, originally when he was born, he was known as Tutankhaten, right? Tutankhaten after his dad and after Aton, the monotheistic faith, right? And later on, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, as in an allusion to Amun-Ra, right? And then he would later on be buried, and he's one of the most famous like pharaohs to ever be found, right? Some of you are like, you're gonna make me throw up, Mr. Terry, if you keep zooming out every 5 seconds. Now look, so this is where they actually found King Tut, is in the Valley of the Kings, right? It's actually this massive burial chamber outside of Cairo and stuff like that, where they found tons and tons and tons of relics and artifacts and dead kings and stuff. And the interesting thing was that King Tut's actually had like a landslide on top of it, and it kept all the artifacts inside of it really well preserved, because grave robbers couldn't actually get to it and stuff like that, which is a really, really cool story. And then fun fact, like the first like 6 people that actually found or went into King Tut's like tomb like actually died like from a bacteria and stuff like that. But ironically enough, also apparently the tomb was cursed, and like it actually said these like sacred curse spells on the front of it. But like the first 6 people that went in there probably got like a bacterial infection from all the dead air and stuff like that on the inside. But the big thing about it though is it's all super interesting, right? Like, so like now, and this of course again is all happening during the 18th dynasty. So a lot of shakeups and a lot of intensity, but good things can't last forever, right? Good things can't last forever, and the Egyptian society as we know it is going to then enter into the 3rd intermediate period. And the 3rd intermediate period, I believe, is going to range from like the 26th to the 30th dynasties, give or take. And like so, and they're going to get invaded by these goofy people called the Hittites, right? So the Hittites are going to be a very majorly important civilization. We actually even get into our next unit. Like, we're not going to talk about their culture and stuff all that much, but we are going to need to talk about them when it comes to one big thing that they developed, right? The Hittites are going to invade Egypt, causing a massive political amount of fragmentation, and Egypt began to crumble underneath the pressure, right? And they were never able to actually really bounce back in the way that we wanted them to, or that we had hoped that they would, and things like that in the historical community. And if Egypt would eventually push the Hittites out, and they would eventually push them out, but not soon enough, because they would eventually be conquered by another group of people. These Westerners that came out of nowhere, the Greeks, right, which are going to be the big first Western civilization that we actually talk about. And we have here some Hittite artifacts and stuff like that, like this double-mouthed jar that was actually used for water, this religious relic of the Hittites, and this thing right here, which is going to be majorly important later on. We do believe that the Hittites are going to be the very first people to start working with iron, right? But iron wasn't widespread in its use yet. Most people were still, like the Hyksos, using bronze, right? Like, so it's very important that I say that. Bronze. Good job, Mr. Terry. So now the big thing about it in general, though, that you also need to understand is that going into it, we are going to now move into some of our smaller kingdoms that were popping up around the ancient East and places like that, right? So now we're moving into some of these little guys that have like these other different like kind of little kitschy things about them. And maybe they were never as large as the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians and things like that. They're just intrinsically a little bit different, right? So we're now moving into those smaller little kingdoms, right? So for example, the fall of the Egyptians is going to be a major thing that's going to politically shake up most of the entirety of North Africa, right? And it's also going to really, really shake some things up in the East as well, right? So like in the East, when we talk about like Mesopotamia, they're going to go through some major factional changes and stuff like that. The Hittites are going to start invading some areas. The Assyrians are going to show up and invade some areas. The Neo-Babylonians are going to come in under Nebuchadnezzar, which again, do not let me forget to tell you the Nebuchadnezzar story. Don't let me forget. I completely forgot to tell you all that stuff, right? So the thing about it is in the long run, it's really okay because the Neo-Babylonians actually came towards the end of the Egyptian civilization anyway, and are kind of existing in parallel with a lot of this stuff. But the fall of the Egyptians is still really, really important because these two great powers, the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, since they're going through so many regime changes and different intermediate periods and things like that, this is going to leave time, area, room, and growth for some of these smaller kingdoms to pop up and also make massive impacts as well, right? So, for example, we're going to oh, no, ew, get away. All right, so, no, that's lame. Don't write that. Now, for example, we're going to see, especially in North Africa and especially close to what is now modern-day Israel and Lebanon, we're going to talk about that a little bit, and you knew where Lebanon was because you were a map quiz, right? We saw that there was dysfunction in these areas, right? There was no law. Wealth had gone away. Centralized governments were collapsing. And after all the invasions, Egypt was left pretty poor and powerless in a lot of ways. And in the third intermediate period and going forward, they would then later on be conquered by the Greeks and then later conquered by the Romans as well, right? But the thing about it is that the lack of their extreme power did give the ability for some of these other groups to come in and make their stamp on things, right? For example, these new settlers to the Nile showed up. These people known as the Cushites, the Libyans, the Nubians, right? They're going to show up and settle nearby what used to be the long-running lower kingdom of Egypt, right? And Egypt was able to actually assimilate these three people briefly, but unfortunately it did not last, and the three settling communities actually ended up breaking away from Egypt, but adopting a lot of their different cultural traits and things like that, right? So going into it, you just need to realize that this huge power of the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians are kind of going through some shaky time periods right now. And we're now moving into this time period where the rise of the Phoenicians can actually finally happen, right? And the Phoenicians are an extremely important people when you're talking about the progression of Western civilizations, right? The Phoenicians are crazy important because of what they did, the service of which they provided, and something that they created, which became a long-standing positive progression idea for the rest of Western civilization, right? And now the interesting little thing about the Phoenicians that you always have to start out with is the fact that first and foremost, they originally came from Lebanon, right? So jot that down somewhere. They're originally from Lebanon, right? Originally, the Phoenicians, we believe, started their society in Lebanon. But then, ironically enough, didn't really have any other major settlements after that, right? So being in modern-day Lebanon was one thing, but then they began to become a society of shipbuilders and sailors, right? And as shipbuilders and sailors, they prioritized one thing over all other things, and that was trade, right? They prioritized trading and moving items from one empire to the other. They would trade Egyptian items and Mesopotamian items and other items from Greeks and the other Mediterranean islands and things like that. And the other big thing was that they were never enslaved by the other mighty large empires like the Egyptians and Mesopotamians because they were these traders that moved goods throughout the entire Mediterranean. And they were also master shipbuilders, right? They made these massive one-sailed ships that resemble in a lot of ways a Greek trireme, right, and stuff like that. They actually made these vessels, though, that could carry large amounts of cargo and move over the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea without ever actually sinking or being subject to so many bad storms and things like that. So eventually, as history began to progress, a lot of people began to depend on the Phoenicians and the service that they provided of moving these different items back and forth and things like that. And as you can see, it wasn't a subtle amount of movement. All these different orange lines right there are the trade routes that Phoenicians would actually take, right? And as you can tell, the Phoenicians only really had these three little settlements right here, including Byblos and Tyre, right? And they're going to bounce around. Now, later on, which is going to become a very important settlement right there, the Carthaginians are also going to be descendant of the Phoenicians as well. But look, they moved all over the Mediterranean Sea, taking product from one place to another. Now, because of this, they're going to become the conduit of cultural diffusion, right? They're going to become the thing that drives cultural diffusion forward, the thing that creates in the movement of elements and ideas of different civilizations back and forth over the Mediterranean and carries all the best parts of all these people to other people so they can share with them, right? And so Phoenicians, the interesting thing about it is, where does their name come from? Just like the Mesopotamians are known as the land between two rivers, right? The Phoenicians are actually known as the purple people. The word itself, Phoenician, comes from the Greek word for purple people, right? And the Phoenicians were called the purple people by the Greeks because of the blue and purple textiles that they had access to. By the way, just to give you a heads up for the rest of your life, you need to remember this. Textiles means cloth, all right? So, like, textiles means cloth. Do not let yourself get lied to by people. Like my 5th grade teacher, Miss Stockburger, lied to me, right? Yeah, Miss Stockburger was like, I think textiles are like tiles. So they're not like tiles or building materials. It's cloth, right? And so they had access to a very specific dye that could dye this item blue, right? And so blue or purple. And the thing is it made this item very, very expensive and is a big reason why purple became a very large color of the royalty later on. But we actually believe that Phoenicians had access to specific, the running theory seems to be like a type of snail shell that they would grind up and stuff like that and mix into water to create the dye, and they would then dye the purple, or then dye the textiles purple because of that, right? And the Greeks were one of their most popular customers, right? The Greeks are a huge customer of theirs, and they're going to be very important as we progress through this story, right? But they also traded with fallen Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Hittites, everybody, right? They brought the best skills that everybody came up with to others. So ironworking is going to spread because of them. Items are going to spread because of them. The movement of grains and other things to different areas so they can be planted and replanted in other spots are going to be because of them, right? And the Phoenicians had to come up with a system of writing to keep track of all of their goods. One that we were hoping at one point or another that other people could be able to read later on, or that made simple sense and stuff like that. So what the Phoenicians did is they created the world's very first phonetic alphabet, right? So now a phonetic alphabet is the largest impact that the Phoenicians ever came up with, right? The phonetic alphabet also is not actually named after Phoenicians. It's named after the concept of phonics, which means of what it's based off of, right? Theirs is based on sound, right? So the largest impact after trading with so many people is the creation of this alphabet, right? They created an alphabet where every single character has a sound, and every single sound goes together to make a word, and those words have definitions, and they can be added together to actually make it so you can pass more information in a written piece of material than you ever did before, right? And so looking at their alphabet would then influence the Greeks and the Romans, and our alphabet is the Roman alphabet. So in the long run, we're using an amalgamated or changed version of the original Phoenician alphabet, right? And it's really, really cool because Aleph right here was actually the symbol that they used to explain oxes, right? And they would actually like use it whenever you look at it, you see the ears of the ox and the horns right there. And they were like, ooh, Aleph, ox, Aleph. That is what we'll use for this. It'll sound like And then we just took it and turned it right side up. And that's where our A comes from, right? When you're looking down here at Heth, Heth literally means offense, right? Like so, like in Phoenician. And Heth then turned into Eta or H, and then we just literally took out one of the brackets, right? Like literally all these different ideas, like Yod, which is like right there, turned into Iota and Kappa, and then we actually developed our alphabet based off the Phoenician alphabet, right? And so this concept of phonics, though, is going to be massively important when we're discussing the growth of Western civilizations, right? And then you're going to see the rise of another kingdom. So we're now going to be done with the Phoenicians for now, right? The Phoenicians kind of are just there. They're very important mostly because of that phonetic alphabet concept and things like that, and the fact that they're that society of sailors, right? Now, the other thing, though, is you're going to see this rise of a very important group of people. A very important group of people known as the children of Israel, right? The children of Israel, also known as the Hebrews, are going to rise up when the Hittites begin to fall due to weak leaders, when Egypt is going to be actually like falling as well due to the invasion by the Hittites, and this gave a ton of small states room to be established. And we believe one of two things happened. We think that a small group of people from Mesopotamia broke away and created the modern-day Hebrews, or we believe that a small group of Hyksos actually broke away and created this like culture known as the Hebrews. A culture of people who for thousands of years have been displaced from where they originally lived, and due to this concept known as a diaspora, which is going to be really important, ended up all over the world, right? Now, this is again a big reason why people of the Judaic faith and as well as Jewish people consider themselves a race, because they can trace their lineage all the way back. So we're back over here, and I jumped back over here real quick because I had to drag up this Prezi real fast. But now that we're moving into talking about the Israelites, right? We're talking about the Israelites. We mainly focus on their religion, right? Like when we're talking about the Jewish people and the Hebrews and things like that, we like to focus a lot on their religion and how it is actually very, very different from the religion of Christianity, right? We like to talk about, well, not very, very different, how we believe that it's the basis of Christianity, and we like to expand off of that and integrate the history of the Hebrew people along with the concepts of their religion, right? So the big thing about it that you need to understand before we go any further is that when we're talking about Judaism, we also mean the Hebrews, or we mean the Jews, or we mean the Israelites, right? And so we're getting into it, and we believe, like I said earlier, that from an ancient, but from a Jewish historian named Josephus, we believe that a group of Hyksos or a group of Mesopotamians broke away and began to found the area near where modern-day Israel is, right? And the big key thing that differentiates them from everybody else has to do with the function of their religion. Because whilst they were surrounded in the ancient time period by all these different groups of people who had multiple different gods and polytheistic religious structures and things like that, the Jewish people, on the other hand, believed in one God, right? One monotheistic concept of a God. This was very different from the Phoenicians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Sumerians and to everybody else. And to them, their God embodied three things. And of course, God's name was Yahweh, right? Like Yahweh, okay, is what they referred to God as during this time period, as well as they still do. And they are going to believe in a God that is three major key components, right? They believed their God was, one, omniscient, which means all-knowing, right? So like when I say omniscient in class, I actually expect you to do this with your hands, right? You go like flash, like moose horns, right? He's all-knowing. And then omnipresent means he exists everywhere. So you're going to flail your arms around like this whenever we're in class and stuff like that because he exists everywhere, right? And they also believe that their God was omnipotent, right? Or is in all-powerful. So you're going to flex on him whenever you say omnipotent, right? So these concepts are going to be very, very important when discussing their culture as well as their historiography because it has to do with their main key idea, that monotheistic faith structure, right? The Hebrews also believed all events in history and faith to be very interconnected, right? That is why a lot of them believe that anything that has ever happened to the historical community of the Jewish people, whether it be positive or negative, is going to actually play into the progression of their history in totality, right? And it actually doesn't necessarily mean that everything that happens is bad. It could be a part of God's plan, right? Because that is a very important concept. For example, this is one of the biggest things that they actually talk about in their Jewish historians and stuff like that. The Hebrews ended up all over the place. I don't know if you know this or not, but the state of Israel was not founded until 1947, right? 1947 or 1949. But the biggest thing about it, though, is even though that's the Jewish homeland state, you have to understand that they have ended up dispersed throughout Europe and Northern Africa and all these other different areas. Why did that happen, right? Why did this concept happen? It's mainly due to this concept. Jot this down. It was because of their diaspora. D-I-A-S-P-O-R-A, diaspora, right? The diaspora is the spreading of the Jewish people because in their early history and things like that, they were conquered by multiple different people, including the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and Neo-Babylonians, right? So you have to understand in this concept, or when this happened, the Assyrians in particular forced them to move and push them off of their land, causing them to move throughout most of the different parts of the Mediterranean. And they spread throughout modern-day Europe, and they ended up in many different areas. And that's why, as they spread out, a lot of people refer to that as their diaspora, right? And that's why their faith ended up outside of the state of what is now known as modern-day Israel, or at the time, modern-day Canaan, right? So the thing about it is when we're looking at the omnipresent map, get it? Now, looking at the entire thing, though, you also have to understand where they have kept their entire text and their history. We believe that most of their history, the Judaic history, is their views on the Bible, that they began to record laws and events of their history in their Hebrew Bible known as the Tanakh, right? And the Tanakh is not the Torah, right? This includes all of their writings, okay? So really quick, I gotta show you this book. Mr. Mathur got this for me, all right? So, where'd it go? Yep. All right, here we go. So Mr. Mathur got me this copy of the Tanakh, right? The Tanakh is actually, as you can tell, a very, very large text, right? And this actually contains most of the historical accounts of the Hebrew people and what has actually occurred to them over their time, right? It talks a lot about the different ideas when the Assyrians conquered them. It actually goes through a lot of their different historical writings. And most people believe that the Hebrew Bible is just the Torah, right? But the Torah is just 1/3 of that larger book, right? The Torah is the one you hear about the most often. It's just one part of it. It's the book of Moses, and it really outlines a lot of daily practice things, right? Like how to eat properly, kosher dieting, things like that, okay? So the Tanakh is actually a very large text that actually has the Torah inside of it. Now, looking at it as well, we also have to understand that the Torah and the Tanakh has actually 24 books in total and 3 separate parts or testaments. Now, when you're looking at the history or like the historical account of all of their people, you also have to understand that like the Tanakh is not traditionally a book, it's actually a scroll, which is really, really cool. And the other idea as well is that from the Tanakh, the Christian like Bible or the Old Testament borrowed 5 of its earliest books, right? The Torah includes the first 5 books of the now modern-day Christian Bible, right? Taken from the Tanakh, and it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is now another big pillar of the Christian faith that it's based off of. And the oldest known copy of the Tanakh is actually this thing known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? We believe that it is the oldest known copy. It was discovered around 1947 by a boy herding his goats, right? A boy was herding his goats along this ridge and like threw a rock into a cave and all of a sudden just heard a really loud crash and like something actually like broke. He goes in there and he found like literal pieces of Jewish history that were 2,000 years old, right? We believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered near the Dead Sea are actually going to be like copies of the original, well, some of the, not the original Tanakh, but of some of the earliest and oldest Tanakhs that are actually 2,000 years old. They're written on papyrus scrolls, which we know is an Egyptian concept or idea, bound in leather and encased in clay pots. And they were found in a cave outside of a city called Qumran, right? But we're going to pick up right there when we get back into class. I'll see y'all soon. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to y'all later.